Hi, and welcome to the Fancy Comma YouTube. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Julianne Howlett. Julianne is an experienced STEM educator and edtech professional with emerging experience in instructional design. She's currently about to complete her MS in Instructional Design and Technology. Her skills include developing learner-centered content and blending technology and instruction to support diverse learning needs. Julianne used to be a teacher in a classroom. That's where she got a lot of her educational experience, but I have less experience with instructional design. I've done some curriculum development, but I had never heard of instructional design as a concept until I read Julianne's content series, Instructional Design in Mind, which we'll link in the YouTube description box. We also worked together previously as she featured me in her Women in Tech blog series. So can you share a bit about what you were writing then with your Women in Tech series versus now with instructional design in mind?
Yeah, for sure. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Shiva. And Women in Tech blog series was a writing series I did to showcase more talent by women who are very underrepresented in the sciences and STEM. So it was an opportunity to interview different women in different professions in STEM, everything from like cybersecurity to like software engineers to, Shiva had, a spot in that talking about science communications. And we had a really great, maybe we can link that as well in the description because that was a good interview we did. And essentially it was to really help kind of do interviews where we would ask questions and kind of talk about these issues from like a more personalized perspective, how it affected them and, you know, challenges that they overcame pursuing STEM, as a woman. So definitely a topic that's like near and dear to my heart because I come from a science background and even like my first teaching masters that I did, like my thesis there was on like the misrepresentation of women in STEM. And so that's a topic that I'm very passionate about. And then, as time has evolved, I actually did a different series in between that one and the one I'm doing now, which is called AI in the Workforce, where I looked at artificial intelligence and how it's kind of moving into certain career sectors and like the ethics around AI and lots of kind of conversations there. And then this new one that I did, I launched this series pretty much like around August of this year. So it's still pretty new. And this one is all about educating people about instructional design and into different learning theories with it and some nitty-gritty stuff as well as some stuff that could be tangential to like business and marketing even. And the first episode or issue in this series is what is an instructional designer. So actually go in kind of in depth about what an instructional designer is.
Cool. What exactly is an instructional designer? Obviously, I can gather that it involves instruction, like teaching, and it also involves design, but what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, really good question. So I would say instructional designers wear many hats and they can definitely work in different environments. So instructional designers would be different than like a traditional teacher because they're doing work more behind the scenes internally, building out content resources. So an instructional designer could work with a company, for example, to build an entire, training course for their staff, right? Instructional designers could also be hired by, and they are hired often by universities to work with the faculty to help them develop resources and get structure and a flow and an educationally savvy experience in place for the learners to take an online course. Instructional designers could also be, they can be working alongside graphic design and software engineering teams, marketing, sales. They kind of, can work in a business environment and work, tangential to these different groups and kind of blend in with each other. So I would say that instructional designers could fall, as far as environment goes, into a few different buckets. So there's kind of the business bucket, right, where you could have a for-profit company, everything from startups and small to mid-sized businesses up to corporations, as well as nonprofits. and then the higher education bucket where you have them working, in universities. And then you can have some variation between, right? Because you can definitely be a freelance instructional designer or have your own business with it and take on clients and projects like that. That's going to be more on the business side, not as much of the university side, because universities will typically hire someone full time. But where they're often not is in K through 12. They really represent building things in an online environment for more of like the businesses and the higher education angle. And there just really isn't as much of a need for this with K-12 unless you were a business that maybe had a product that was marketed to a K-12 audience and you wanted support to build that in an online environment. Sometimes you'll see crossover. Like I know an instructional designer who specializes in like gamification, and she does work with building tools and resources for younger kids. Um, but for the most part, you're working with more adult learners, and you're not actually, instructional designers aren't in the classroom. They're not disseminating information like that. They're working, more behind the scenes with technology and leveraging different teams to get something achieved.
Um, so that's quite interesting. So I would assume, so just I guess out of curiosity, school districts are kind of strapped for cash right now, and they don't have a lot of resources. The teachers are overworked. So is there a budget for instructional designers at schools, or is it more like textbook companies, or like where do instructional designers work?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say as far as where they work, I would kind of go back to those different buckets, right? Like the business bucket, the higher education bucket. If you're looking at a K to 12 district, there are positions that an instructional designer could go into. For example, like sometimes you might find them as like a technology director or like, curriculum lead. Sometimes they can plug into those roles, but there are even like different master's programs for that, like an MS in curriculum, instruction and literacy or something like that. Um, I would say that there really isn't a need for instructional designers at the K to 12 level because most of the time instructional designers are working with, an adult learner population. That's kind of one piece of it. The other piece of it is, a lot of K to 12 is done in person. There is an online component. The teachers themselves are, kind of building that out. So you will actually find a lot of former teachers go into instructional design. Like I've taught in the past, a lot of my classmates have taught or even are currently teaching now and looking to get out of it. So it's more likely that you maybe have experience in that environment and then you leave it, and you move on to different things as compared to like taking the instructional designers and putting them back in. And that's something that really appealed to me about it because I had done some K to 12 teaching experience more on the secondary education end. That's where I was certified, was science, so middle and high school science, specifically biology. I've also done a good amount of ed tech experience working for different ed tech companies and more of the marketing angle. So, but I really needed more of a leg up to really move me out of the temptation to go back to K to 12. I didn't want to go back in the classroom and, I didn't want to get into substitute teaching. I did enjoy private tutoring and I actually established a business with that when I lived in Chicago and did some things there. But I needed more to kind of help shift me from where I was before to, where I'm at now, really. And, definitely kind of going through the graduate school route was right for me. This was actually a program that I was accepted to many years ago. And like at that time, it just didn't work out to do it. So it was actually something I was interested in many, many years ago and, kind of came back to it. And it really has been working out to be like the next iteration or evolution of, my interests and experience and talents and like the way I want to, move my career forward.
So instructional design then is more like a college and community college type of thing.
Yeah, you could say that, but also there are a lot of instructional designers that also work in business, right? And then you can have overlap because you can have a business that has clients that are college faculty, right? Or college learners. So I would say there's definitely more of an emphasis on adult learners with instructional design. And definitely college can be a strong component of that more so, I would say you can find instructional designers in community college, but you'll especially find them in like four-year institutions, But definitely with businesses, you'll find it a lot because let's say, just like hypothetical example, let's say like you own a toothpaste company, right? And you have a lot of employees, like you have 500 to 1,000 employees or something. I mean, that's a lot to me because usually I'm working with like smaller businesses. I know there's way more, employee numbers for companies. You might have some science that you want to teach them about the chemical composition of the toothpaste and why it's effective, right? You're going to need a method to disseminate that at scale. You can't just like hold one meeting one day and get them all in a room. I mean, I guess you could, but it wouldn't be very effective, right? You'd probably be far better to take the tenets of what you want them to learn, what do you want to teach and educate them, and figure out how can you structure this into like an asynchronous online course, right, that they could take on their own time. And you'll find this in a lot of professions where you have to do professional development. There's different names for this, like professional development, L&D, learning and learning and development, different things like that. And that's a huge area that needs support, where you have people that are experienced instructional designers, educators that can go in and they can build those resources so that it's a positive experience for the learner. And that's really what instructional designers are all about, is like making a supportive, educationally savvy, they would say like pedagogical experience for the learners. And typically it's the business that has the content. So typically the instructional designer is not the subject matter expert, right? They're not expected, because you can't know everything on every single topic, but you kind of step in and say, okay, what is the content that you're trying to teach? And then who is your target audience? And how do we find a way, maybe it's an online asynchronous course, maybe it's a series of workshops, so instructional designers would help with that and help them come up with a plan of how they could disseminate that. And then there's, on the flip side of it, obviously this is something that would be repeated often, so you can collect metrics on it. There's like a whole scientific component to testing it, and then, reiterating on it and finding ways to improve it as well, because there should always be like an evaluation component to these things that you do. So you can see kind of how it's very different from like a K to 12 experience, right? Where you're designing lesson plans and you're mostly working with younger kids and you're in the classroom every day. Instructional design takes you out of that environment and you work with a different population, more so an adult learner population. Although, like I said, there are nuances. If you were working for a company that was designing a tool that might be catered to young kids, like an ed tech company selling a product or tool to schools, you could still be designing something for a younger audience, but you're in an environment, a business environment, where you're primarily interacting with adults, if you will.
Yeah, so it sounds like things like online courses, trainings. I'm a tutor, so I have to do a bunch of different trainings, and as a sub, I did various trainings that actually were more like lectures, but it would be cool if they were like interactive and interesting. But so you've written about Mayer's multimedia principles, and it has, these are basically ways these principles are used. They're developed by Richard Mayer. And this guy basically came up with a list of things to do to make learning better in instructional design. And it focuses on learning science, which is always interesting to science people in science education, because it's like science of science type of thing, science of science education, I guess. So what are these principles? Like, can you, are there different categories? Which of those are most often used in online learning? What can you tell us about these principles as people, me, and probably our viewers that have maybe never heard of these principles before?
Yeah, Richard E. Mayer. I'm an educational psychologist, and he's still alive. You can even find some videos of him talking about things on YouTube. He actually did experiments with these things. So he actually empirically studied these things. He put together these 12 multimedia principles. Multimedia in general would be defined as the use of audio with video, and text. So having different formats together. And there is actually like a whole neuroscience component to this, because you get into topics like working memory and cognitive load and things like that, and how much someone can actually, and even like sensory processing and auditory channels, so much stuff. So it does get quite complex, but if you're into science and neuroscience and, that kind of thing, it's pretty cool. And basically there's 12 different principles. They're not necessarily grouped into specific chunks. However, if, we kind of look at them, we could kind of group them a little bit. So there's 12 principles, and they each represent kind of different things. So for example, I'm just looking at one here. So like the image principle, this one's about if you're developing a micro lecture or a lecture, do you have the presenter on screen, right? Or do you just have the slides and the text being displayed? And he actually looked at, does this help when the instructor is like in that little instructor bubble, or if they're full screen and they're talking about it, or does it not help? In his experiments, he actually found, and it's funny I picked this one because this is one of the more controversial ones. But in his experiments, he found not necessarily. Sometimes it can actually distract the learner from the content, because they might be super focused on like your face or like your features or different things about your, physical appearance that could actually distract you from listening to the content. So there could be just as much value in presenting that slide deck with narration, voiceover, and not having like your physical presence on the screen. But there's a mixed response to that, because some people will say, well, when I see my professor on the screen, I do feel connected to that professor. And when you're in an online environment, that's really important. And that gets to a whole separate topic, is, community building in an online environment and how you can feel connected. So that one's a little bit debated, because there's some evidence to suggest that might not be entirely the end of the line there, that, it's just better to just do narration only. But that's kind of one example of one. There's others that if you're going to have like a video on display, I just want to get the name for you of the specific one I'm thinking of. Yeah, so the spatial contiguity principle and the temporal contiguity principle. So basically these talk about if you're going to have something displayed on screen, and maybe you're going to be like, let's say that you're trying to teach a group of, like aviation engineers, right? You're trying to teach them like the anatomy of the airplane. And maybe you have a diagram up on the screen, and maybe you're talking about a very specific part of the airplane, right? When you do the narration, you would want the part of the narration that you're talking about to be synced up with the visual that's on display. So even something as granular as that of, are you syncing up what you're communicating about with what you're showing to people, right? And, likewise with kind of sound effects and visuals, there's different layers there. Also, if you have labels or text on the screen, are those labels and text totally separate from where, the visual is? So like, we know this from science, that if you have like a figure, or a chart that you present in your paper, you're going to put the caption right below it. You're not going to have the caption like, more dissociated from it. Some of this stuff might appear intuitive, but it's powerful to kind of have it be captured. And then again, it's been experimented, like empirically tested. So it's kind of one of those, some of them are like, oh, I didn't realize that that would affect me until somebody said, yeah, that affects you. Some of them are like that, um, and there's all different ones. So, those are two there. The redundancy principle is about, humans learn best with narration and graphics as opposed to narration, graphics, and text. So the redundancy principle is, reducing text on screen, which is hard to do, right? Because we're really indoctrinated with like slide decks where there's heavy text and people just read the text verbatim from the slides. And this, is really not best learning practice, because when that happens, the learner has to pay attention to you reading the text while also reading the text themselves. So like cognitively, they have to invest energy in doing both things at the same time, right? Whereas If you had, a narration over it, or even if you were delivering in person, because instructional designers can help with in-person things too, but they do a lot more work like, online, you would want to have maybe just bulleted notes, even ideally like a visual on display, and then you talk about it. Now, arguably that's harder, right? Because you have to be more rehearsed. You have to know your stuff. You can't just rely on reading the text off the screen. But actually, it's better for the learner if it's more consolidated and more visual on the screen, and then you provide the audio, whether it's in person or the narration, because it can be overstimulating to the learner, when there's so much there and they don't know who to pay attention to. Do they listen to you speaking it? Do they read it? And especially if there's like text and complicated diagrams, that can get pretty messy.
So, two things that occur to me listening to you explain these principles are, firstly, these are kind of things we were told creating PowerPoints or, presentations, because I don't know if we use PowerPoint to the level we do now. When I was a kid in high school and college, in the early 2000s, we did not even have smartphones. So PowerPoints were not really a thing. But I do remember that one of my professors at MIT, when I was taking one of my very first brain and cognitive science seminars, he used to say, everyone has these really fancy PowerPoint slides and they add all these weird graphics and everything, but it actually really distracts from the text. And so he always had his slides be just black and white. And so I sort of adopted his same style because I was like, I don't want to distract people. I want people to notice the science and the quality of the science, be able to understand that. And that's actually the first principle of this. So that the coherence principle, that humans learn best when there's not distractions. So it's like, I feel like people know about these principles. What prevents them from using these principles in an instructional setting? Or do they get lazy, or are there other standards, or what?
I mean, definitely the one about reducing distracting stimuli. You can definitely have colors, and especially instructional designers, if they're designing something for the company, they're going to want to use brand colors, brand fonts. There is going to be a visual aesthetic to it, right? So you're not necessarily stripping that away, but you are critically examining, how many things are, kind of popping up, or do you have flat, do you have like excessive images here that could confuse people? Like, how much of this do you actually need? And instructional designers are constantly asking, how do I close the gap between what it is that you want them to learn and where they're at? And that could tie into so many different things, like their motivation to do it, how succinct the materials are, how well displayed the materials are, how well organized the materials are. There's so many different components to that. But to answer your question, I don't know if there is like a direct answer to it, but I would assume life experience. We get kind of stuck in a pattern of something, and we've been very indoctrinated with heavy text slides, and I do think there is a bit of a laziness component, because sometimes what's easy for you as the presenter isn't always in the best interest, for the learner. And we even see this in K-12 teaching, where like they've done studies where someone has a particular learning style preference, right? So for example, I'm very visual, but I can also be kinesthetic. I need to see things, but I also learn by building and creating things. I would say my weakest one is like auditory. Like if you tell me something to do, I'll usually tell the person, can you text it to me, or can you write it down, or I'm going to have to write it down, because I'm more likely to retain it or remember it if it's visually captured as compared to just telling me. But for some people, auditory is a strength. That's their main one. There's some interesting tools you can go online and like test yourself about that too. Um, but they've looked at like a teacher that's more of a visual learner. Well, they're probably going to develop presentation materials that are more visually oriented, you know, or if they're more of an auditory learner. So basically, they're going to lean into where their natural preference is. And that's okay, but we have to be mindful that that may not be in the best interest of all the learners in the room, because you're going to have learners in the room that won't be primarily visual. You'll have kinesthetic learners, you'll have auditory learners. Do you know what I mean? So I think some of it is like internal bias, like that we approach it of like kind of what's best for us, but we all have to flip it and say, okay, well, what's also ideal for the learner? And this is what instructional designers do a lot of, because you will find companies that are like, oh, I just take the content and I whip it into a slide deck, but there's no thought, there's no structure, there's no like educational theory involved in the way they put it together or how they're presenting it. And that's where you get really difficult, boring, heavy experiences for the employees, right?
So let me ask you another question. Going back to these actual these rules that Meyer came up with, or the pre-principle, it basically says that humans, if you know a little bit about something, you're able to learn very efficiently and a lot better. If you know a little bit about something, you're primed basically or prepared to learn more about it. And I've never known that to be false, but I guess like you said these are derived from science research. So like, do you know what kind of research went into this? You said neuroscience, and so maybe they studied
Yeah.
this.
So I would say there is a distinction between neuroscience and learning science, as weird as that sounds. But, neuroscience, we can get into truly like the anatomy of the brain and the neurons and how they fire, and the different neurotransmitters. Learning science looks at what's the science behind how people are learning and how things are being retained and absorbed. So it leans a little more on things like cognitive load, working memory, long-term memory, things like that. So there can be overlap, but they do have differences. And obviously neuroscience is a huge topic, right? Like you can study so many different things within neuroscience. So I know he's actually written several books, and in his books, you can actually see like actual examples of images that he generated or video clips that he generated, and basically would have different sample sizes, and test effectiveness of if it was almost like a b testing in a way. If it was done like this versus like this, was there a statistically significant difference in learning retention? And he used like p values and everything, so there's like a statistical component as well as like a whole experimental model was set up there. That's probably the best way I could like recall it just from memory. But if you're really interested in this, you can definitely check out his books, and you can see like the visuals in the books of kind of some mock-ups of how he designed this. Um, but this one, so this the pre-training principle would be teachers, K to 12 teachers would know this as scaffolding. That's actually how it's talked about in the K to 12 world, is that you're building things to get them to where they need to be. Again, some of these sound really intuitive, but they're not always done. That's kind of the thing, right? They're not always done because these are like effective learning things. So I think his goal was to not only do things from an experimental approach so that it had like statistical significance to say, yes, this is why I'm saying you should do this, but also to kind of capture things in one place so that instructional designers, people that work in learning sciences could take this and use this as like a model to kind of lead, and move forward. Because I guess like anything in life, right, you're going to have different opinions, on what works, what you should do. And again, think about this in a business context, right, where you have business professionals that have no experience in education or learning design, and they're putting together training materials for people, so something that might be innate to like a K to 12 teacher, scaffolding, for example, might be totally foreign to someone in a business world, where they haven't prepared content to teach and train people with. So, yeah.
So a lot of this is very intuitive to me. Maybe it's because we've both been in education. Maybe if someone that is like working at a company and needs to do a training doesn't know anything about education. So um, they maybe have a marketing background or they have some kind of HR background, but they don't have the educational background. So I guess that's where these principles of instructional design can be very helpful to them. One of the other ones I thought was really interesting that is on this list is the voice principle. And it's interesting to me because it says that humans learn best from human voices rather than computer voices. But um, a really interesting trend I've noticed is that I spend a lot of time on Facebook just like clicking through reels just when I'm bored or when I'm like tutoring or something online. And I actually learn a lot from them. And a lot of them have like robot voices, but I mean, obviously, we've all watched Instagram reels and like TikToks. Um, they're like a minute. They have a lot of information. For some reason, there's like a really active teacher talk, and I watched a lot of it as a sub. Um, I'm no longer a sub, but when I was a sub, I used to kind of like watch hours and hours of those just to figure out what teaching is like. And I actually did learn a lot from them. So I was like, maybe we should be using TikToks as curriculum or as uh, how do you feel about maybe, firstly, that's one of my ideas is to just teach everything in TikToks. The other idea I had is to have robot teachers because like Gen AI is like transforming everything. And I was like, well, what if teachers run out of energy to say like, sit down, go do your work. But if you had a robot that did that, and it could process the environment and just like sit you back down whenever you're walking, getting out of your seat or something, like, um, do you think that those types of novel, we don't think of learning as involving TikTok or robots. How do you feel about these types of like out of the box type of ideas? Because I feel like I have tons of them, but they don't fit into the traditional teaching framework.
So I guess we probably have to unpack them one at a time. I mean, obviously AI is becoming more and more a thing, and there's going to be more and more ways that it integrates with society, and we're going to have to like look at things. I think in general the consensus is that K to 12 teachers probably don't need to be concerned about being, replaced by AI, because there's so, and in general, the more you layer on areas of complexity, the farther you get from like that concern of being replaced by AI. But if it's more of like a rote task, right? Like a one stroke or like a rote task of like do this automation or produce this writing blurb or produce this set of code, that's where AI is starting to go in, and it is affecting freelance writers, freelance coders, even administrative staff. I actually read an article recently. And interestingly enough, may disproportionately affect women because a lot of women are in administrative positions, and that's concerning. That AI may disproportionately affect women. But as you layer on more and more layers, so for example, if you're writing a freelance blog article, that's a different experience than a journalistic type article, right? Where you have to interview different subject matter experts. You have to meet with them, you have to collect the data, you have to synthesize it, dispel it down, and then write the story. So I think that we have to look at how much, layering is involved. And, with a teacher in a classroom, there's so many layers because you're producing content, you're a disciplinarian, you're managing the politics of the school, you're managing communications. There's so many different layers there. I mean, I think it's interesting to extract one piece of that, like you were speaking to kind of discipline and saying if that was outsourced to AI. My initial response to that is I don't really know if the kids would take it seriously. Do you know what I mean? Because they could, in theory, punch a robot in the face, maybe get in somewhat trouble, but they're going to get in a lot more trouble if it's a human being that they punch in the face. Do you know what I mean? So there's a bit of like, I don't know how much they would take that seriously. And then this is not even factoring in the cost of what those would cost, and that school budgets are really, strapped and stuff like that. So yeah. What was the other idea you had with TikTok? I'm not on TikTok. I actually for one of my classes we had to do like a social media audit, and it was pretty, I like went full on into it because of my science background, and design like a whole kind of experimental, framework to track myself for a week. We had to do it. And what I found from like studying myself with that for a week is that I am way biased towards long form content. I actually spend much less time than I thought on Facebook and Instagram, and I'm like on YouTube constantly. I'm constantly listening to talks, and I think it's because it's also easy for me to layer it with other things like more rote chores like meal prepping or cleaning and things like that. So I have like hours and hours and hours of total, consumption time from YouTube, and much less than I thought, from the other ones. I'm actually not on TikTok for the reason that it just never appealed to me. I never got into it. Um, so I think that people have different preferences, and this is like an eternal debate. Short-term content, long-term content, this comes up in the marketing world as well. The argument I would make though is if you just focused on the TikTok side, you're really doing a disservice to learners because they're going to go through academic experiences where they're going to have to sit through a lecture. They're going to have to sit through something that's long form content. So if you bias them towards short, repetitive cycles of things, I think it will make it harder for them to be comfortable with an experience that's, going to be prevalent through university, prevalent through K through 12, things like that. I think where you find the sweet spot is you take long form content. And I think that's why something like YouTube Shorts are really popular, right? Because you take long form content and then you can repurpose that into shorter sound bites. And then those shorter sound bites can be a door that people can walk into the long form content. So I think there's a place for both. But my instinct would be to be cautious about becoming like all or nothing about it, basically, right? Because you would do a disservice to people that would have to experience long form content if you're only giving them short form content, and vice versa. If it's only long form content, there's still a place for that short form content. I feel like I said the same thing so many times, but you know what I mean.
It's just interesting to me because what I learned from subbing, no matter where I went, different school districts, there would inevitably be people on their phones, and I'd be like, "Oh, what are you doing?" And they'd be like, "Oh, I'm recording a TikTok," or like they'd be recording a TikTok in class, which I don't think they're supposed to be recording a TikTok in class, but at some level, when kids are doing so much stuff that you can't, you only have one mouth, you only have a limited amount of patience, you can't be like, "Hey, stop recording all your TikToks." But like I feel like there could be an entire digital marketing curriculum created for young people that want to be influencers and explain like how to create content, how to have hashtags, like how to edit some video, how to maintain a social media presence for public relations to like get more followers and to get brand deals. Like I think that could be like a thing, but it's like right now I feel so conflicted with this idea that like, but in one class I went to, the people their assignment was on their cell phones. So I was like, well, that's brilliant. Kids are already all completely on their cell phones. Why don't they just have all their homework on there and they can just do everything on that little screen? But there's a whole movement to ban cell phones right now, and it's amazing how much I talk about this with people in education and like how much of a problem and how weird it's been that screens have changed. Screens and COVID are two things that have disrupted education. And it's like COVID has already happened. We can't really go back in time, and that we really were the sacrifices and stuff we all made. We had to do what we had to do to get past that time. But like screens, uh, I don't know. We have a lot of workforce challenges, like especially in STEM. Like we have AI, climate, just having enough people that understand and like science so that they can go into science professions, especially those that require sophisticated AI tools in the future, and they're going to need specialized computer training. And like right now, when I used to walk into classrooms, I would just see people on their phones that were not excited about learning. And so I wonder, like, is that a failure of cell phones? Is it just the way we're kind of, maybe we're not really like feeling failure-y, but we're just kind of chilling on our cell phones, but we actually are learning a lot in those interactions. Like writing a comment kind of can test your English skills in a way. You can say, I'm no longer in teaching, so I can say things like this and not get fired. But those one-off interactions, like, do you feel the same anxiety about the future of the STEM workforce as predicted by what our classroom interactions look like?
Well, I think like part of this story kind of definitely speaking to the STEM thing is like a good topic, but just kind of zooming out a little more broad than that, I think some of this is motivation, right? We have intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And some people are just more internally motivated to learn than others. This isn't even factoring in, learning disabilities, or if you have attention deficits, which make it even harder, right? Or dyslexia, dysgraphia. I think that there's a lot of reasons. You could even talk about food, what kids are eating and how that can make them hyperactive and make it difficult for them to sit still, in classrooms if they're eating really processed foods or really sugary foods or things like that. I think this is like the attentiveness and like the motivation of like kids in schools is something that's been like a problem, even when I was in school. It was a problem. Like you have kids that just don't want to be there. They're disruptive. They don't want to learn. I think that that's pervasive. you know. And I don't know if that's getting worse because of cell phones. Maybe it is, because even when I was teaching, like kids had cell phones and, I have to tell them to put it away. But now it's even worse because you have cell phones plus social media, right? So, like, I actually had to write a paper on this just recently in one of my classes about, mobile video and like video and the web and, all the different ways that these things kind of interact and how they could affect faculty and teachers. And, there are teachers that are filmed without consent, and like a kid can take that and upload it to social media or something, and this gets into interesting stuff of like, um, if that teacher did something wrong, but they didn't give consent to be videoed, right? And in most instances, the students reprimanded and the teachers reprimanded, for doing the teachers reprimanded for doing the behavior, but the students also reprimanded because they filmed without consent. So there's a lot that starts to get into this, Um, I feel like the representation with STEM, this is like an eternal kind of topic. I studied it in my first master's. I did actually one course proposal in one of my classes with this master's about, women in STEM. And I think there are so many factors with it. But I think part of it is, having good role modeling, having people see that there are people that look like them that can do these things, and I think that's like an important part of it. When I was a teacher, like way at the beginning, I remember I did just like a little kind of social experiment with my students. And I said, okay, draw me what you think a scientist looks like. And these were seniors, these were juniors and seniors. These were not like young kids. These were like 17, 16, 17, 18-year olds. And most of them, like, I don't know the exact percentage, but the overwhelming majority drew like an Albert Einstein character, which is effectively a white male. But, scientists come in all shapes, sizes, colors, like there's so much variation in what a scientist can be. And I think there's also a lot of stigmas around it. Like people think that science is more isolated, that you are in a lab all day. And it's like you could be working in a lab or you could be a field biologist that goes and collects samples and is actually outside all day, and there's a total social component to it because you prepare research, you put them into papers, you put them into publications, you present at conferences, you talk to other scientists. So I think that it's like breaking down those beliefs that people have about it, as well as giving them more positive role modeling, and then kind of even distilling it down further. Like when I taught science to students, I would say, even if you just take away from my class that I want you to look at things with an observational lens and make, critical thinking and make deductions after you've observed instead of just making assumptions, that's a win for me, because there are skills from this that you can take and apply in your life, even if you choose to not pursue science. And I do think that's something that has to be communicated, because I think people think like, well, why should I try or why should I care about this? I don't want to be a biologist or a physicist or a chemist or whatever. But there are skills there, critical thinking skills that apply no matter where you go and what you do in your life. And even still to this day, I find myself saying to people, that maybe come up with something like, oh, I think this or this is truth. And I'm like, okay, what evidence do you have to support that? That comes from a scientific perspective, thinking like that, using the scientific method and things there.
I just read a book it's called Science with Impact, and it's one thing that the book said, it was how to make science more impactful. And it's interesting because the author, Anne Helen Toomey, said things like, reframe your hypotheses so that they include communities that you're hypothesizing about, which like that's simple enough. And then another thing was boost science capital. She basically defined this concept called science capital, and that's just like proximity to science, especially in young people. Having science capital is associated with pursuing science careers and being literate in science. And um, I want to say that like a lot of the learning that I do and have done as a student and now as a freelancer, where I've never in a class, well, as a teacher, I was in classrooms, but I don't do any of my learning in a class. I learn from conversations with people and from watching TikTok. Well, I don't spend time on TikTok, but like Instagram Reels or just like reading like one chapter of a book here and there. Or like those are skills that are, or like in the pandemic, reading Twitter and finding a list of experts in COVID science so that I could keep at the very, very early days of the pandemic so I could know what was happening. Like stuff like that, those are very important life skills. And I think like having a curated Twitter list is actually a life skill that probably many young people that are on their cell phones all the time have. But I'm trying, it's hard for me. I try to not be one of those like old, put away your cell phones, like you're never going to be successful kind of people, and try to think of the transferable skills that kids these days get from interacting in the way that they do, which is so different than how we grew up. But it's definitely really interesting to think about what the world is like and the skills they will use in the future, and maybe that's different skills than we have used in our careers. And those are like huge questions, but I do agree that the workforce and having role models is always huge, especially for um, because yeah, scientists, a lot of scientists look like us, like we both have science backgrounds, so, and neither of us look like Albert Einstein. I think that
Yeah.
that so
And most
um
scientists, don't have to be. And I think, with the cell phone piece, you know, I had moments where I was asking them to put them away, but I was also experimenting. That school district at that time was doing like BYOT, bring your own technology. So I actually would integrate the cell phones, like especially if I did polling, like in K to 12 teaching, you talk about, like they have all these names for it, like a bell ringer, or like an exit ticket, something that basically you're doing a pre-assessment at the beginning and then an assessment when they leave. And sometimes I would have them use, because there's like sites like Poll Everywhere, that they can go on their cell phone, and they could do a poll, and then the results would show up on on a website on my screen. So sometimes I would use the cell phones, like integrate them, and in that environment we were encouraged to do that because they were sort of experimenting at that time. And I do think that there can be a place for it. And in a way that's a good thing, right? Because people do have to learn how to moderate. Like, we're going to be on devices regardless. So, but people do have to learn how to moderate their device usage with being present and attentive, which is, a whole topic of its own, right? So
Yeah, and I feel like if we figured that out, we would figure out something really fundamental about human psychology, and like we finally would be able to like turn being wasting time on our cell phones into something really important.
yeah, and
Um,
I think that's where too, like, I found myself, because I used to be really really on Instagram a lot, like, in the past years, and I find myself, like, I definitely have friends that I only DM with, they live in other states or things like that, or I have content that I consume on there that is valuable to me. But what I don't like is when I go on and I have a specific purpose. Oh, I'm going to look up this account, or I want to double check this post, or I want to look for this message. And I find myself being hijacked, if you will, where it's like I went on there with a specific purpose or intention. And this happens with YouTube too, because like the algorithms are so good that they give you content that you want to watch, and you go in like, oh, I want to do this, but it's like so intentionally built to scatter you, right, and distract you. On the positive side of that, you can go down rabbit holes and learn new things, meet new people, have experiences that maybe you wouldn't have been exposed to before, so that's good. But it can also be challenging, because it makes it harder for you to feel like you're in control of your experience or your learning, so sometimes I've been finding myself, just not going on, because it's like I need to focus on the task at hand. I'm trying to write this paper. I think more and more I find myself being mindful of my time, my energy, my attention, and how I'm using it. And like, for example, I have like notifications turned off pretty much on all the apps, except for those that would be really beneficial. My perspective is like, I tell the app what I'm going on. The app doesn't tell me.
I'm exactly the same way. I find it distracting. Like you're just doing your daily chores, and then suddenly the news pops onto your phone and tells you something incredibly sad. Like I can't handle that, and I don't know who can't, but it sucks you in. We now have so many competing priorities, and uh, there was something else you said about technology. Yeah, it keeps changing, and along with it, it keeps changing society. And then we look at our classrooms and we're like, this is so different. It's because society is changing as well.
There's so much stuff in the K to 12 system too that's so outdated. Like, even if you take just the concept of having summers off, this actually comes from like farming times, when more of the country, the students were farmers and they had to, I mean, obviously there's other components too, like not being able to afford air conditioning over the summer and stuff like that. But there was an expectation that during those summer months, they had to go and work on the farms. You know what I mean? Like hundreds of years ago. And like, if you just look at that alone, that's like a good example of how much the school systems like have not innovated. Do you know what I mean? And then you will have schools that do year-round school and they experiment with this and they do like 2-week breaks, but it's year-round. And um, I don't know if maybe there are studies done looking at the difference between the two. I'm not sure, but even just the system itself of how the calendar is set up is actually archaic because it's based on reasons that, I mean, I'm sure there's still students now that do need to go and leave school to go work on their parents' farm. But I would imagine the numbers are different than what they were when that was created as part of the structure of it, right? So it's pretty interesting if you kind of look at it that they are doing a lot of catching up, which is why it's like all the more important that if the system doesn't catch up, the teachers really have to be working on innovation.
And that's a tall order for the teachers I have personally met because they're really tired and stressed out and they already have so many requirements to do and they have so many kids they have to keep track of that are maybe lagging the national standards. Here in Oklahoma, they changed the standards and our students still did not meet them. So we're 49th in education. Uh, but other places, even other places that are more high performing are struggling with the exact same issues. So it's very much a national thing. And one thing I'm really excited about, not to get political here, but given the amount of politicization that has happened in schools, I'm really excited that Tim Walz could soon be the vice president because I wonder to what extent the federal standards or even federal attention or even just electing a teacher or educator to office can actually, if not change these issues, just bring attention to them. I was in DC recently for a conference and I went to a hotel to meet up with my conference or event attendees, and I got out of the hotel, and right in front of me was the Department of Education. And I was like, oh my gosh, this building is so large, but I've never seen this building. I think I've walked by it once before, but it was like a huge building. And I was like, oh my gosh, wow. I did not even realize this existed because it was just really bizarre. I don't know why I have moments like this where I like don't but it's just like there's a lot that could be done that maybe we don't know could be done because we haven't thought about it. So one thing that's really good is having discussions like this to kind of shed light on best practices for instruction and places of improvement and just reflecting on how weird society is after a pandemic and after the advent of cell phones. And um, of course, like society itself is always changing and our school systems are always changing. It's been fun to chat with you. And I think that our viewers will really appreciate this perspective.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shiva. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.